Rain had been falling since before dawn, heavy enough to erase the fence posts beyond the lower pasture. From the kitchen window, Elias Mercer watched muddy water slide across the yard in thin brown sheets. The drainage ditch beside the barn was already full. Beyond it, the farm road had disappeared beneath a mixture of clay, standing water, and broken gravel. At 72, Elias had learned not to argue with weather. You prepared for it, worked around it, or paid for believing you were stronger than it was. That morning, he was paying. A diesel engine growled somewhere near the southern gate. Elias pulled on his canvas coat and stepped outside. The rain struck the metal roof of the porch like handfuls of thrown seed. Halfway down the hill, a feed truck sat crooked in the road. Its rear wheels had sunk almost to the axle. The driver stood beside it, boots buried in mud, staring at the tires as if anger might lift them free. "I told the dispatcher this road was bad," he shouted when Elias approached. "Didn't know it was a swamp?" "It wasn't yesterday," Elias said. The driver looked across the pasture toward the cattle gathered beneath a line of cottonwoods. The truck carried enough feed to last Elias nearly 3 weeks. Without it, he would have to ration what remained in the barn. The driver climbed back into the cab and tried again. The engine roared. Mud sprayed against the doors. The truck moved less than a foot before sinking deeper. "That's it," the driver said, shutting off the engine. "I'll need a tow." Elias did not answer. He was looking past the truck. 100 yards away, the abandoned railroad crossed the farm on a raised bed of dark stone. Rusted rails ran between weeds and young trees, cutting a straight line through the rain. No train had traveled there in more than 30 years. The wooden ties had split with age. Blackberry vines wrapped around the steel. In summer, snakes warmed themselves between the rails. In winter, snow gathered in long white ribbons along the embankment. Elias had spent most of his life resenting it. The line had divided his father's best pasture. It had forced cattle toward narrow crossings and made equipment routes longer. After the railroad company abandoned it, no one returned to remove the steel or repair the collapsed fencing. The county called it a liability. The bank called it a reduction in land value. Elias's father had called it the iron scar. But now, beneath the hardest rain of the season, the stones under the track were still visible. No standing water, no deep ruts, no sinking mud. The raised grade remained firm while the farm road below it dissolved. The driver followed Elias's gaze. "That old railroad caused half your trouble, didn't it?" Elias walked toward the embankment. Water ran down both sides of the slope, but not across the top. The crushed stone beneath his boots shifted slightly, then settled. He stamped once. The ground held. He crouched and pulled away a mat of wet grass. Underneath lay layers of angular rock packed tightly together. The railroad builders had laid it to carry locomotives, weighing hundreds of tons. They had shaped the grade to remain stable through rain, frost, and spring thaw. The rails were rusting. The structure beneath them was not dead. Behind him, the truck driver called, "You hear me? That line ruined this place." Elias stood slowly. For the first time in decades, he did not see the railroad as a barrier. He saw elevation, drainage, a straight route from the southern gate to the barn, a road the rain had failed to destroy. "No," Elias said. The driver frowned. "No what?" Elias looked along the track until the rails vanished behind the trees. "We just forgot what it was built to do." Above the pasture, there was no whistle, no smoke, and no train coming through the storm. But beneath Elias's boots, the old line was still carrying weight. The railroad had entered the Mercer farm before Elias was born. His father, Samuel, had been 26 when the surveyors arrived with tripods, and rolled maps tucked beneath their arms. They walked across the south pasture without asking where the cattle watered or which fields flooded in spring. They drove red stakes into the soil and spoke about grades, distance, and public necessity To them, the farm was a line on paper. To Samuel Mercer, it was 40 years of family work. The proposed route crossed the center of the property, cutting the grazing land from the barn and separating the creek meadow from the higher fields. Samuel objected, but the railroad company already had the authority it needed. They paid for the strip they took and promised that the line would bring prosperity to the county. Samuel used most of the payment to rebuild fences and create 2 livestock crossings. Neither worked well. The western crossing was too narrow for machinery. The eastern one filled with water after heavy rain. Cattle resisted the steep approach, and calves sometimes slipped between the stones. Every trip from one side of the property to the other became slower and more dangerous. Then came the noise. Freight trains passed before sunrise, shaking windows and scattering cattle. Sparks from the wheels once ignited dry grass beside the track. Samuel and 2 neighbors fought the fire with wet blankets and dirt until the volunteer crew arrived. From that day forward, Samuel called the railroad the Iron Scar. Elias grew up hearing the words. He was 8 when his father first took him to repair the fence along the northern embankment. A locomotive thundered past while they worked, close enough that Elias felt the vibration inside his chest. Samuel waited until the final car disappeared. "Remember this," he said. "A company can call something progress even when someone else pays for it." Elias remembered. For years, the railroad dictated the rhythm of the farm. Gates had to remain locked. Livestock had to be counted after every storm. Equipment routes were planned around crossings instead of fields. When one culvert failed, water backed into the lower pasture and destroyed part of the hay crop. The company repaired the culvert months later. The lost hay was Samuel's problem. By the time Elias was 30, the trains had become less frequent. The sawmill closed first. Then the grain warehouse near town stopped using rail service. Freight moved to highways, and weeds began appearing between the tracks. One autumn evening, a final locomotive crossed the Mercer property, pulling 4 empty cars. No announcement was made. No one in town understood it was the last train until months passed without another teeve. The silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it brought a different kind of trouble. The railroad company stopped maintaining fences. Brush spread along the embankment. Drainage ditches filled with leaves and silt. Loose spikes appeared beside the rails. Trespassers followed the abandoned line across the farm, leaving bottles, food wrappers, and sometimes open gates behind them. Samuel wrote letters. The company replied that the route was inactive but not formally abandoned. Years later, another letter claimed maintenance responsibility had been transferred. No one could tell Samuel to whom. The railroad remained on the land, but responsibility for it seemed to belong nowhere. When Samuel died, Elias inherited the farm and the unresolved strip of steel running through it. A property appraiser marked the corridor as an encumbrance. The bank treated the divided acreage as less efficient. An insurance agent warned that the abandoned structures could create liability. Everyone agreed the line reduced the farm's value. No one offered to remove it. Elias believed them because their conclusions matched what he had been taught. He repaired fences around the railway. He avoided the rotten ties. He warned children away from the old bridge. Whenever machinery had to travel from the barn to the south pasture, he took the long route around the embankment. The railroad had taken enough from his father. Elias refused to let it take more. Yet on the morning after the feed truck became trapped, he returned to the track alone. The rain had weakened to a fine mist. Water still covered the farm road, but the railroad bed remained firm beneath his boots. He walked farther than he had in years. Near the eastern crossing, he found a stone culvert hidden beneath vines. Water moved through it in a steady, narrow current. 50 yards beyond it, the track curved past the barn and continued toward the southern gate. It was almost the exact route the feed truck had needed. Elias stopped. For decades, he had measured the railroad only by what it had damaged. He had never measured what remained. The company had left him rusted steel, broken T's, legal confusion, and a memory his father could never forgive. But it had also left a raised corridor built straighter and stronger than any road the Mercers had ever been able to afford. Elias looked down at the rail disappearing beneath wet grass. The scar had not changed, only the way he was looking at it had. The letter arrived 3 days after the storm. It came in a white county envelope, folded twice and stamped with a red notice across the top. Elias opened it at the kitchen table. The county had received complaints about unsafe conditions along the abandoned rail corridor. The letter listed overgrown brush, exposed spikes, unstable ties, broken fencing, and unauthorized access. Elias was ordered to clear the corridor, secure the dangerous sections, and submit a remediation plan within 60 days. Failure to comply could result in daily fines. Elias read the notice twice. Then he placed it beside the unpaid feed bill. Across the room, the old wall clock clicked with the same patient rhythm it had kept since his father's time. Each sound seemed to count down the days. The storm had already cost him more than he could afford. The tow truck had charged for 2 vehicles because the first one nearly became stuck. The feed delivery had been rescheduled. A washed-out section of fence needed new posts. One of the lower fields would be too wet to enter for at least a week. The county's timing could not have been worse. By noon, Elias was sitting across from a loan officer at the First County Bank. The office smelled of paper, coffee, and polished wood. On the wall behind the desk hung a framed photograph of a newly built subdivision where pasture land had once stretched toward the highway. The loan officer, Martin Hale, was young enough to be Elias's grandson. He turned the pages of Elias's application without looking up. "You still have no all-weather access to the south acreage." Martin said, "I have access. In dry conditions. I've been using that land for 50 years. Martin tapped the appraisal report. "The issue is not whether you can reach it. The issue is whether the property supports reliable commercial access in all seasons." Elias leaned forward. "The old railroad does?" That made Martin look up. "The railroad?" The grade stayed dry through the storm. Martin glanced back at the report. "The abandoned corridor is listed as an encumbrance. It runs from the south gate to the barn. It is not an approved farm road." "Not yet." Martin closed the folder. "The bank cannot issue a loan based on a possible future use of a disputed structure. It isn't disputed that it is there." "No," Martin said carefully, "but ownership, liability, access rights, environmental condition, and permitted use may all be disputed." Elias felt heat rise behind his collar. The bank had never cared who owned the railroad when it reduced the value of his land. Now that he saw a use for it, ownership suddenly mattered. Martin slid the application back across the desk. "If you improve the property, resolve the corridor issues, and provide updated income records, we can reconsider. Without the loan, I cannot make the improvements." Martin gave him the practiced expression of a man trained to make refusals sound reasonable. "I understand." Elias stood. "No," he said. "You understand the paper?" Outside the bank, a black pickup was parked beside Elias's truck. A man in a clean brown jacket leaned against the hood. His name was Warren Pike. He had bought 3 farms in the county during the past 2 years, each one from an owner who could no longer carry the debt. Warren smiled when Elias approached. "Heard you had trouble in the storm. News travels fast. It travels faster when land is involved." Elias unlocked his truck. Warren handed him a business card. "My offer still stands." The number written on the back was less than half of what Elias believed the farm was worth. "You call that an offer? I call it realistic." Warren pointed toward the road leading out of town. "Your farm floods. It is divided by an abandoned rail line. The bank will not finance improvements. And the county is beginning enforcement. That corridor alone could cost you years." Elias put the card in his pocket without reading it again. "No one wants land cut in half by a dead railroad." Warren continued, "Sell now? And the problem becomes mine." Elias looked at him. "And what would you do with it?" Warren shrugged. Clear the structures. Separate the parcels. Maybe sell the stone. There are buyers for land along the highway. There it was. Warren did not see a farm. He saw pieces. A pasture to divide. Stone to remove. Road frontage to sell. A struggling old man standing between the property and its next use. Elias drove home without stopping for lunch. The county notice waited on the kitchen table. Beside it sat the bank's rejected application and the feed bill. 60 days. That was how long he had before the fines began. He could sell. He could spend money he did not have removing the corridor. Or he could prove that the thing everyone called a liability was worth more intact than destroyed. Near sunset, Elias carried a measuring wheel, a notebook, and his father's old railroad lantern to the embankment. He began at the southern gate. Every 100 feet. He recorded the width of the grade, the condition of the ties, the location of the culverts, and the distance to the nearest pasture gate. By darkness, his boots were wet and his hands were stiff. But the first page of the notebook held a straight line connecting the gate, the lower fields, the creek crossing, and the barn. At the top, Elias wrote 4 words, not a railroad anymore. The next morning, Elias returned to the southern gate before sunrise. He carried the same notebook, a shovel, a steel rod, and a carpenter's level that had belonged to his father. The lantern was unnecessary in daylight, but he brought it anyway. Its dented red frame reminded him that the railroad had once been built by men who understood weight, water, and distance. He began with the ground. Every 50 feet, Elias pushed the steel rod between the ties. In the pasture, it sank easily into softened clay. On the rail bed, it stopped after only a few inches. Beneath the weeds was not ordinary farm soil. There was coarse stone on top, smaller rock below, and a compacted layer underneath. The materials had been placed in stages so water could escape instead of collecting beneath the track. That explained why the grade had survived the storm. But Elias wanted more than an explanation. He needed to know whether the old structure could still work. He followed the line north. At the first low section, he found water flowing through a stone culvert beneath the embankment. The opening was partly blocked by leaves, roots, and a rusted bucket. Elias cleared the debris with his shovel. The water immediately moved faster. He watched it pass beneath the track and spread into the drainage ditch on the other side. The railroad had not simply crossed the wet ground, it had been designed to move water through it. Farther on, Elias noticed that the rails rose gradually toward the barn. The change was almost invisible to the eye, but the carpenter's level confirmed it. The incline was steady. Without the sharp dips that made his farm road collect water, he wrote in the notebook, raised grade, stable slope, existing drainage. Near the eastern pasture, he found a shallow trench running beside the track. Grass had hidden it for years. When he removed the dead growth, the trench formed a clear channel leading toward another culvert. The railroad builders had controlled water on both sides of the embankment. Elias stood and looked across his farm. His road had been built where generations of wheels had happened to pass. The railway had been built after surveyors studied elevation, curves, soil, and drainage. He had hated those surveyors for deciding where the line would cross. Now he understood that they had left behind something no struggling farmer could have afforded to construct from nothing. At mid-morning, Elias drove to the home of Calvin Reed. Calvin was 81 and had worked maintenance on the branch line before it closed. He lived in a small house behind a repair shop filled with old tools, oil cans, and railroad signs. When Elias explained what he had found, Calvin listened without interrupting. Then he laughed once. "People think the rails were the railroad," he said. "Rails were only the part they could see." Calvin pulled a dusty map tube from a shelf. Inside was a copy of an old maintenance diagram. It showed the Mercer section of the line, including culverts, drainage channels, slope measurements, and the depth of the stone bed. Calvin pointed to the markings. Locomotives cannot climb sudden grades. They cannot sink into mud. The line had to stay firm in every season. Elias studied the diagram. The route from the southern gate to the barn was nearly straight. It crossed two wet areas, both served by culverts. It also passed close to three pastures that currently had no reliable vehicle access after heavy rain. What would it take to make it carry a tractor? Elias asked. Calvin did not answer immediately. That depends on what is still sound, he said, and what is rotted, shifted, or washed out. He tapped the map. Do not trust it because it was built well once. Inspect every foot. Clear every drain. Test the base. And do not start tearing out steel until you know who owns it. Elias nodded. Calvin leaned back in his chair. But the grade itself, that was built to carry more weight than anything you own? On the drive home, Elias kept thinking about those words. More weight than anything you own. For 30 years, the county had treated the corridor as debris. The bank had treated it as a defect. Warren Pike had treated it as material to strip and sell. None of them had looked beneath the rails. That afternoon, Elias returned with stakes and orange marking tape. He marked every culvert. He marked every soft section. He marked each place where the track came close to a pasture gate, water line, or field entrance. By sunset, small orange flags ran across the farm in a straight line. For the first time, Elias could see the corridor not as a scar, but as a plan. The rails were rusted. The ties were failing. But the old railroad men had built something deeper than either of those things. They had built a spine. Elias chose the shortest section first. It ran 400 yards from the southern gate to a narrow pasture entrance near the barn. The rails were still in place, but the western edge of the grade was wide enough for a small tractor if the brush was cleared and the loose stones were leveled. He did not call it a road. Not yet. In his notebook, he labeled it Test Section 1. Before touching anything, Elias spent 2 days checking boundaries and old property records. Calvin had warned him that abandoned did not always mean unowned. The rails might belong to one company, the land beneath them to another, and the access rights to someone who had not visited the county in decades. Elias had no money for a legal fight, so he worked only on the portion confirmed inside his deed line, beside the track rather than on top of it. He cut blackberry vines, removed fallen limbs, and pulled rusted wire from the weeds. He marked exposed spikes with red paint and stacked loose debris away from the cattle. The work was slow. At 72, Elias could no longer swing a brush blade for hours without stopping. Every 20 minutes, he rested against the tractor tire and studied the grade ahead. But each cleared yard revealed the same thing. The stone base was still there. Near the southern gate, he spread a thin layer of fresh crushed gravel over the uneven surface. He did not bury the old ballast. He only filled the low places and created enough width for one vehicle. Then he drove the tractor onto it. The front wheels climbed the embankment. For a moment, Elias felt the machine tilt toward the ditch. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and eased forward. The tires pressed into the gravel. The grade held. He continued at walking speed, listening for cracking ties, shifting stone, or the sudden hollow sound of a collapsed culvert. Nothing moved beneath him except loose gravel. 400 yards later, he reached the pasture gate. The trip had taken less than 5 minutes. Using the farm road would have taken nearly 20, and after heavy rain it might have been impossible. Elias shut off the tractor. The silence felt different there. Not empty. Useful. That afternoon, he made the first practical change. A water trough in the southern pasture had always been difficult to supply. The old pipe crossed low ground and froze in winter. When it broke, Elias had to haul water by tank. He laid a new line along the raised corridor. The grade kept the pipe away from the wettest soil and gave him a direct path for inspection. At 3 points, he added shutoff valves inside simple wooden boxes, so one leak would not disable the entire system. By sunset, water flowed into the trough. The cattle approached cautiously. One old cow drank first. The rest followed. Elias watched them gather around the clean water and wrote another note. Access and utilities can share the same spine. The next test came 3 days later. Rain returned during the night. Not a violent storm, but enough to soften the clay road and fill the wheel ruts near the creek. Elias waited until morning, loaded 6 sacks of feed onto a small trailer, and drove toward the new route. The pasture road was already slick. The test section was wet on the surface but firm underneath. The tractor moved without spinning. No deep ruts formed. No mud wrapped around the tires. The trailer remained level enough that none of the sacks shifted. At the far gate, Elias stopped and looked back at the narrow strip of gravel. It was not impressive. No new machinery, no expensive pavement, no dramatic construction, just a forgotten embankment. Cleared by hand and used for a purpose its builders had never imagined. But the numbers mattered. The shorter route saved fuel. It saved time. It reduced damage to the pasture. It allowed him to move feed even after rain. Most importantly, it gave him proof. That evening, Elias carried his notebook to the kitchen table and calculated the distance he traveled each week between the barn and southern fields. Then he compared it with the railroad route. The difference was larger than he expected. If the entire corridor could be made usable, he would save hundreds of miles of tractor travel each year. For a large farm, that might have meant little. For Elias, every gallon mattered. The next morning, Warren Pike's truck slowed near the southern gate. Warren stared at the cleared section and the fresh gravel. "You building a road beside that thing?" he asked. "Testing one." "With what money?" "Less than it costs to stay stuck." Warren looked down the grade. "That old line will collapse somewhere. It always does." Elias rested one hand on the fence post. "Then I'll find where." Warren shook his head and drove away. Elias watched the truck disappear. The experiment had not saved the farm. It had not solved the county notice, the bank loan, or the legal questions. But for the first time, the railroad had done something for him instead of against him. And small proof, Elias knew, was how a system began. The failure began with a sound Elias almost ignored. A low, hollow knocking came from beneath the eastern section of the grade during the second night of rain. He heard it while checking the cattle. Water had been falling steadily for 6 hours, filling the drainage ditches and darkening the fields. Elias carried a flashlight along the test route, watching the gravel for movement. The road still looked firm. Then the knocking came again. Not from the rails. From below them, Elias climbed down the embankment and found water pressing against a curtain of roots, leaves, and broken branches lodged inside an old culvert. The opening was barely visible beneath the current. He had cleared the smaller drain near the southern gate. He had marked this one on his map, but he had not opened it. The water was already too deep to work safely. Elias decided to return at first light with a chain, and the tractor. That decision cost him. Bedum. The blocked culvert had turned the embankment into a dam. Water spread across the upper pasture. Searching for another path, it found the lowest edge of the grade near a section Elias had covered with fresh gravel. The current cut through the loose material first, then it reached the older stone underneath. By the time Elias arrived, brown water was pouring across the route in a channel wide enough to carry fence posts and branches. Gravel rolled down the slope. A section of the embankment had begun to collapse into the pasture below. Elias shut off the tractor and stared. The grade that had seemed permanent was moving. He drove to higher ground, fetched sandbags, and worked for nearly 2 hours, trying to redirect the flow. The bags slowed the water, but they could not stop it. Every time he closed one channel, another opened. Then he heard cattle bawling near the eastern fence. A young calf had crossed onto the abandoned track through a gap hidden by brush. One leg had slipped between 2 rotted ties. The animal twisted in panic, tearing skin above the hoof. Elias ran toward it. He cut away the wire, pried apart the broken wood, and pulled the calf free. The injury was not fatal, but the sight of blood against the blackened timber struck him harder than the damaged road. He had been so focused on proving the corridor useful that he had begun treating it as safe. It was not safe. Not yet. By afternoon, a county inspector stood beside the washout. Her Name was Dana Holt. She wore waterproof boots and carried a camera, a clipboard, and a copy of the notice Elias had received. She photographed the exposed ties, the damaged slope, and the muddy water entering the pasture. "You altered the corridor," she said. "I cleared brush and added gravel beside the track. You also encouraged vehicle use. On my land. That does not remove your responsibility for runoff or livestock access." Elias pointed toward the blocked culvert. "The water caused this." Dana looked at him. "The blocked culvert was part of the condition you were ordered to address." The words were accurate, which made them harder to hear. Elias had wanted the county to see that the railroad could become an asset. Instead, he had given them stronger evidence that it was dangerous. Warren Pike arrived before the inspector left. He did not walk down to the washout. He stood near his truck and surveyed the damage from the road. "I told you the line would fail," he said. Elias continued stacking broken ties away from the cattle. Warren stepped closer. "My offer is still open. It may not be after the county adds penalties." Elias looked at the ruined section. The fresh gravel was gone. The slope was cut open. The new water line hung exposed where the soil beneath it had washed away. 3 days of work had disappeared in one night. Warren lowered his voice. "You are trying to build a future on something already abandoned." Elias finally turned toward him. "No," he said. "I tried to use it before I understood it." That evening, Elias sat alone at the kitchen table. His notebook lay open before him. On one page were the early observations: dry grade, shorte route, stable surface. On the next were the costs: gravel lost, pipe damaged, calf injured, county inspection. He crossed out the words Test Section 1. Below them, he wrote, "A road is not only the surface. The railroad had carried water as carefully as it had carried trains. The culverts, side ditches, slopes, and crossings were not separate details. They were one system." Elias had taken the part he wanted and ignored the parts he did not yet understand. Near midnight, he called Calvin Reed. "I was wrong," Elias said when the old railroad man answered. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Elias frowned. "What is good about it? You found out before you bet the whole farm." The next morning, Elias returned to the damaged grade with no gravel and no tractor, only a shovel, the maintenance map, and a different question. Not how much of the railroad he could use, how the entire line had once worked. Calvin arrived just after sunrise in an old pickup with one headlight clouded white. He brought no heavy equipment, only a transit level, 2 measuring rods, a pribar, and the rolled maintenance map Elias had seen in his workshop. "The mistake people make," Calvin said as they stood beside the damaged embankment, "is thinking the railroad was built from the top down." He tapped the rusted rail with his boot. "This is the last layer. The line was really built from the water up." They began at the failed culvert. Elias cleared the remaining branches while Calvin measured the height of the grade on both sides. The opening beneath it was larger than Elias had realized, but years of silt had reduced it to less than half its original capacity. Calvin pushed the rod into the soft material. "Not one storm's worth," he said. "This has been filling for years." They worked until the stone arch was visible again. Behind the blockage, the water had carved a shallow basin through the pasture. On the old map, the same area was marked with a thin blue line. Elias traced it with one finger. "There is no creek here." "Not now," Calvin said. "But water remembers routes longer than people remember names." The line had once been a seasonal channel. During dry years, it looked like ordinary pasture. During heavy rain, runoff from the northern slope gathered there and moved toward the culvert. When the opening became blocked, The water had nowhere to go. Elias had blamed the storm. The real problem had been years of neglected flow. They continued north, stopping at every drainage feature shown on the map. One culvert had collapsed near the center, but still passed a small amount of water through broken stone. Another was completely hidden beneath thorn bushes. A third remained open but emptied into a ditch choked with roots. Each one changed the meaning of the land around it. The low pasture was not simply wet. It received runoff from two slopes. The dry patch beside the barn was not accidental. The railway ditch intercepted water before it reached the yard. The narrow strip where grass stayed green in August followed an old drainage path below the embankment. For most of his life, Elias had viewed those places as separate problems. Calvin showed him they were connected. By noon, orange flags marked more than culverts. They marked direction. Blue flags showed where water approached the grade. White flags showed where it left. Red flags marked damaged sections that could not safely carry equipment. From the barn hill, the pattern became visible. The railway was not a straight road laid across random ground. It was a controlled crossing through a moving landscape. Elias opened his notebook. If I repair the drainage first, then rebuild the access beside it, maybe. Calvin said, Maybe? You are still thinking about the tractor. Elias looked at him. What should I be thinking about? The whole farm? Calvin pointed toward the southern pasture. You haul water there? You fight mud here. Your cattle cross at the wrong place because the gates were built around the rails. Your delivery trucks enter low ground before they reach the barn. All those problems touch this grade. He moved his finger along the map. One corridor can carry more than wheels. That afternoon, they walked the route again. This time, measuring distance from the grade to every major part of the farm, the southern trough stood less than 30 feet away. 3 pasture gates could be relocated to meet the corridor. The old loading pen sat close to the highest section, a storage shed, unused since Samuel's time, stood beside what had once been a railway service platform. Elias began sketching. A narrow all-weather lane along the safest edge, a buried water line protected above the wet clay, new livestock gates opening directly onto the corridor, drainage ditches restored before gravel was added, dangerous ties removed only where ownership and permission were clear, fencing on both sides to keep cattle away from exposed rail. At the center of the plan, Elias drew a thick black line. Not a road. A spine. The county inspector returned 2 days later. Dana Holt expected to find more gravel work. Instead, she found Elias and Calvin opening drainage outlets and marking unsafe sections. Elias handed her a copy of the new plan. No vehicle use beyond the southern test section until the culverts are inspected. He said, livestock access will be fenced. The washout will be stabilized from the outlet upward, not covered from the top. Dana studied the map. You had this professionally prepared? Not professionally. Calvin raised a hand. Just correctly. For the first time, Dana's expression softened. She pointed to the old seasonal channel. You understand this may require a drainage permit. I understand. And the ties may contain treatment chemicals. They will be handled separately. And you still need confirmation of ownership before removing rail. I know. Dana closed the folder. This is better than what I saw last week. It was not approval. But it was the first sentence from the county that did not sound like a warning. After she left, Elias stood on the repaired edge of the washout. The damage was still visible. The bank had not changed its decision. Warren's offer remained in his pocket. Nothing had been saved yet. But the railroad was beginning to reveal itself, not as a dead machine, as a set of relationships between height, water, distance, and work. Elias had spent years trying to manage each problem alone. Now he could see that the grade touched all of them, and if he rebuilt carefully, it might hold them together. Elias began with water, not gravel, not gates, not the road. Water had nearly destroyed the project once, and he would not make the same mistake twice. For 10 days, he and Calvin worked from the lowest outlet uphill. They cleared silt from the old culverts, opened the side ditches, and reinforced the washed section with stone placed in layers instead of dumped across the surface. Where the embankment had weakened, Elias stayed off it entirely. Only after the first hard rain passed cleanly beneath the grade did he move to the next step. He fenced the dangerous sections. The rusted rails remained, but cattle could no longer wander onto them. At each pasture, he built a narrow gate opening toward the corridor. The old crossings had forced animals through mud and steep approaches. The new gates met the raised lane at firm ground. Then he extended the water line. The pipe followed the high side of the grade, where it remained visible enough to inspect and protected from the wettest soil. From that single line, Elias installed branches to 3 troughs. Each branch had its own shut-off valve. Before, one broken pipe could leave half the farm without water. Now, a damaged section could be isolated in minutes. Calvin watched Elias close one valve and open another. "You are using the railroad like a service line," he said. "That is what you told me. I told you it could carry more than wheels." Elias looked down the corridor. "It carries whatever the farm keeps needing." The lane itself came next. Elias did not try to make the entire route wide enough for trucks. That would have cost more than he had in disturbed sections that were still uncertain. Instead, he created a narrow all-weather path for the tractor and small trailer. He used the existing stone where it remained stable. He added fresh gravel only in low pockets. Near each culvert, he left inspection space instead of covering the structure. The result was not smooth. It curved around old rails, narrowed beside trees, and slowed near the repaired washout. But it remained firm after rain. For the first time, Elias could move from the barn to all 3 southern pastures without entering the clay road below. The change affected more than travel time. He no longer drove through grazing areas every day. Deep tire ruts stopped appearing near the troughs. Cattle did not have to scatter each time the tractor crossed the field. Feed could be delivered from the corridor through short gates instead of carried across soft ground. What had once divided the farm was beginning to organize it. Elias marked each gate with a number. Pasture 1 opened for 4 days, then rested. Pasture 2 followed. Pasture 3 remained closed until the grass recovered. The corridor allowed him to shift the herd without driving them across the whole property. A gate opened, another closed, and the cattle followed the firm lane toward fresh forage. The system was simple, but simplicity mattered when one man was doing the work. Near the old service platform, Elias repaired the abandoned storage shed. The roof leaked and one wall leaned outward, but the stone foundation was sound. He used it for mineral blocks, fencing tools, pipe fittings, and emergency feed. Before, those supplies were scattered between the barn and 2 distant sheds. Now they sat beside the route that reached every pasture. Dana Holt returned near the end of the month. She walked the corridor slowly, photographing the repaired culverts, new fencing, and marked inspection points. "You have not removed the rail," she said. "Not where ownership is unclear. You have not widened the route. Not where the base has not been tested. And the damaged ties, separated and covered until disposal is arranged." Dana nodded. The county notice was not canceled, but the daily fines were suspended while Elias completed the safety work. It was the first official relief he had received. That evening, Elias stood beside the barn and watched cattle move through Gate 2. They walked in a narrow line along the corridor, calm and unhurried. Water waited in the next pasture. Feed was stored halfway down the route. The tractor sat on firm ground. No part of the system was dramatic by itself. A pipe, a gate, a ditch, a lane, a shed. Together, they changed how the farm worked. Warren Pike drove past again the following morning. This time, he stopped. He watched Elias tow a loaded trailer from the southern field without touching the muddy road. "You put a lot of effort into that old line?" Warren said. "I put effort into the farm." Warren studied the gates and the water boxes. "Still looks like a railroad." Elias rested one hand on the tractor wheel. That is because you are still looking at the rails. Warren said nothing. Elias looked down the corridor toward the southern gate. He no longer saw a structure left behind by a company. He saw access, water, storage, rotation, and control. The farm had always possessed separate pieces. The railroad gave those pieces a shape. The old line was no longer cutting the property in half. It had become the spine holding everything together. The first proof came in the form of hay. For years, Elias had lost part of every wet season cutting because the lower fields became inaccessible before the bales could be moved. The grass might be dry enough on top, but the clay road beneath it stayed soft for days. A tractor pulling weight through that ground left deep ruts, damaged roots, and sometimes buried itself to the axle. That autumn, the weather turned just as the final cutting was ready. Dark clouds gathered over the western ridge, while Elias watched the baler finish the last row. The forecast called for heavy rain before morning. In earlier years, he would have moved only what he could reach before dark and accepted the rest as a loss. This time, he opened the pasture gate beside the old railway. The tractor climbed onto the raised lane with a trailer carrying 6 round bales. The load was heavy enough to make the engine strain, but the wheels did not sink. Elias drove slowly past the repaired culvert, the water valves, and the old service shed. At the barn, he unloaded and turned back. Trip after trip. The corridor carried the hay north, while the first drops of rain darkened the dust. He brought in the final bale less than an hour before the storm broke. By morning, the lower road was buried in mud. Every bale was dry beneath the barn roof. Elias stood in the doorway counting them. 23. The year before, he had lost 7 bales after a similar storm. At current prices, those 7 had represented feed he later needed to buy. The railroad had not produced the hay. It had prevented the farm from losing it. That distinction mattered. A week later, he sat at the kitchen table with fuel receipts, feed invoices, and his old mileage notes spread in front of him. The new route had shortened his daily tractor travel. Rotational grazing had reduced the amount of supplemental feed used in the southern fields. The water line saved hours once spent hauling tanks. The service shed reduced wasted trips back to the barn for tools and mineral blocks. None of the savings looked dramatic alone. Together, they changed the numbers. For the first time in several years, the farm's autumn operating costs had fallen instead of risen. Elias brought the records to the bank. Martin Hale reviewed them in silence. "You completed all this without financing?" he asked. "Not all of it." Elias placed photographs of the corridor on the desk, but enough to prove the route works. Martin compared the images with the earlier appraisal report. In one, the railway was hidden beneath brush and broken timber. In another, a narrow lane connected fenced pasture gates, water points, and the barn. The bank still cannot treat the corridor as a standard road. Martin said, "I am not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" "To count what it changes." Elias pointed to the figures. Less fuel, less lost hay, lower feed costs, better access, more usable acreage. Martin leaned back. A bank could dismiss an idea. Recorded savings were harder to ignore. He did not approve the full loan Elias had originally requested, but he offered a smaller equipment line, conditional on continued county compliance and proof of ownership for any future rail removal. It was not victory. It was movement. Elias used only part of the credit. He repaired the old loading pen near the service platform and built a covered collection point beside the corridor. Until then, customers who bought eggs, vegetables, and small cuts of beef had driven to the farmhouse, crossing the yard and interfering with daily work. Now orders could be collected near the southern gate. The first Saturday, Elias placed a wooden table under the shelter. On it he arranged cartons of eggs, jars of preserved beans, late tomatoes, and several bags of ground beef from the previous season. Above the table, he hung a hand-painted sign. Iron Line Farm. The name had come to him while cleaning the old shed. He had considered calling it Mercer Farm, as his father had, but that name carried the history of a property divided and diminished by the railway. Iron Line Farm carried something different. It did not hide the scar. It claimed it. A woman from town arrived with 2 children and stared at the rails beyond the fence. "Is that where the name comes from?" she asked. Elias nodded. "My grandfather said a train used to pass here," she said. "It did. Are you rebuilding it?" "No." Elias looked along the lane where the tractor had carried the hay. "I am giving it a different job." The children asked to see the old service platform. Elias walked them only as far as the safe viewing area and explained how the raised stone bed moved water away from the tracks. The woman bought twice what she had ordered. The next week, she returned with a neighbor. Word spread slowly. People came for food, but they stayed to ask about the railway. Older visitors remembered the sawmill train. Younger ones had never known the county possessed a rail line at all. The story gave the farm something Elias had never planned: an identity. By the end of the month, he had sold nearly everything stored for autumn. The income was modest, but it arrived directly, without a wholesaler setting the price. One evening, Elias stood beside the new sign as cattle moved through Gate 3 behind him. The corridor carried a trailer of feed in one direction and customers in the other. Water ran beneath it. A pipe followed its edge. Hay rested safely in the barn because the lane had outrun the storm. The old railroad had once carried products away from rural land toward distant markets. Now, for the first time, it was bringing people back. Elias touched the weathered sign. The harvest was not only what the farm had grown, it was what the farm had finally stopped losing. The first wildflowers appeared where Elias had expected weeds. He noticed them in early spring, growing along the southern edge of the corridor where he had cleared brush the previous autumn. Small yellow blooms opened between the old stones, followed by purple clover and white asters. For years, Elias had treated every plant near the railway as something to cut down. This time, he waited. Bees arrived before noon. They moved from flower to flower along the embankment, following the line as steadily as trains once had. By evening, sparrows were feeding in the grass, and a pair of bluebirds had begun inspecting a fence post near the old service shed. The corridor was changing again. It had first become a road, then a water line, then a route for cattle and feed. Now it was becoming an edge between systems. Calvin had once told Elias that railways created their own narrow landscapes. The raised ground stayed drier than the fields. The ditches held moisture longer than the slopes. Sunlight reached some sections all day, while trees shaded others. That variation created opportunity. Elias began carefully. He did not plant the entire corridor at once. He divided it into test sections, just as he had with the road. Along the western edge, he sowed native grasses with deep roots to hold the slope. Near the old loading platform, he planted flowering species that bloomed at different times of the year. At the northern bend, where winter winds crossed the pasture, he added a row of young trees to form a future windbreak. He kept the plants away from culvert openings and inspection points. Nothing was allowed to interfere with drainage. The lesson from the washout remained with him. Every new use had to support the system, not hide it. By summer, the changes were visible. The deep-rooted grasses reduced bare soil along the repaired slope. Flowers attracted bees, beetles, and butterflies. Birds hunted insects near the pasture gates. Elias noticed fewer flies around one water trough and fewer caterpillars on the vegetables near the barn. He did not claim the corridor had solved every pest problem, but the farm felt more balanced, more alive. Visitors noticed too. The woman who had first brought her children returned one Saturday with a local photography group. They asked permission to walk beside the safe section of the old line. Elias hesitated. He had spent years keeping strangers away from the railway. The county still required fencing around hazardous areas. The rails and ties were not playground equipment, so he created rules. Visitors stayed on the marked path. Dangerous sections remained closed. No one crossed fences or entered livestock areas. Groups came only at scheduled times. The first walk included 11 people. Elias met them at the Iron Line farm sign and led them toward the old service platform. He showed them the raised stone bed, the restored side ditch, and the culvert that had caused the washout. That failure saved the project, he told them. One visitor looked confused. How? It forced me to understand the whole line before using the useful parts. At the southern pasture, Elias explained how the corridor connected the gates and water points. At the flower section, he showed how the embankment created a strip of dry ground through the wetter fields. The guests had come expecting a story about old trains. They left talking about drainage, soil, grazing, and ruse. 2 weeks later, the local historical society asked Elias to host another walk. Then the school agriculture teacher called. Then a restaurant owner from town asked whether Iron Line Farm could provide eggs and seasonal produce for a weekend menu. The railway story was opening doors Elias had never approached. He added a small fee for guided tours, not because the walks required much equipment, but because they took time away from farm work. Visitors often purchased eggs, beef, preserves, or vegetables afterward. One Saturday brought more income than Elias had once earned from selling a full truckload of hay through a dealer. The money helped. But the greater change was how people viewed the property. The abandoned line was no longer described only as dangerous or ugly. Newspaper photographs showed wildflowers beside the rails, cattle moving through organized gates, and Elias standing near the repaired platform with his maintenance map. The county tourism board called the farm an example of rural reinvention. Martin Hale, from the bank, attended one of the tours without announcing himself. Elias saw him near the back of the group, taking notes, while Calvin explained the old drainage system. Afterward, Martin stood beside the collection shed and watched customers load produce into their cars. "You have more visitors than some businesses in town," he said. "They came to see the railroad. They are buying farm products. That is because the railroad gave them a reason to stop." Martin looked toward the corridor. For the first time, he was not studying it as a liability on an appraisal. He was watching it create movement. By the end of summer, Elias had named the tours the Dead Railroad Farm Walk. He disliked the name at first. The line no longer seemed dead to him, but the contradiction attracted attention. People wanted to understand how something abandoned could produce value again. Standing beside the flowered embankment one evening, Elias watched bees drift above the stones while cattle grazed beyond the fence. The tracks carried no trains. Yet along the old route moved water, animals, customers, stories, and life. The railroad had not returned. Something more useful had taken its place. The letter from the county arrived in a brown envelope this time. There was no red warning across the top. Instead, the first page carried the seal of the Regional Development Office and a request for a meeting. Elias read it twice at the kitchen table. The county was studying a rural heritage route that would connect several farms, the old mill site, and the abandoned station outside town. Iron Line Farm had been identified as a possible anchor location. They wanted permission to discuss access. 6 months earlier, the county had ordered Elias to secure the corridor or face fines. Now it wanted to bring visitors onto it. Elias folded the letter and placed it beside the original violation notice. The two envelopes looked almost identical. Only the language had changed. At the meeting, Dana Holt sat beside 2 tourism officials and a county planner. A large map covered the table. The proposed route followed part of the abandoned railway before turning toward the river road. "We are not asking for ownership," the planner said. "We are discussing a limited access agreement for scheduled events." Elias studied the map. The route passed directly through the section he had repaired, fenced, and made useful. "What would the county provide?" he asked. The room became quiet. The planner had expected gratitude. Not negotiation. Elias pointed to the corridor. You want visitors? Visitors require parking. Signs. Insurance. Maintenance. And safe crossings. I already paid to solve problems, everyone else ignored. Dana looked down, hiding the beginning of a smile. The tourism director cleared her throat. We could consider infrastructure support. Consider? We could fund improvements related to public access. Elias leaned back. The old version of himself might have accepted simply because the county had finally recognized the farm, but recognition did not repair culverts. It did not replace fencing or pay for time taken from cattle, crops, and customers. The corridor works because it is part of the farm. Elias said, any agreement must protect that. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks. In the final proposal, the county agreed to fund a small parking area near the southern gate. Safety signs, additional fencing, and part of the insurance cost for scheduled public events. Iron Line Farm would retain control over dates, group sizes, and closed sections. The dead railroad had become valuable enough for the county to pay for access. Then Warren Pike returned. He arrived on a clear afternoon while Elias was repairing a gate latch. Warren stepped from his truck wearing the same clean brown jacket he had worn outside the bank. Only his manner had changed. I hear the county is planning something out here. They are discussing it. Warren looked toward the collection shed, where 3 customers were loading boxes into their cars. You have done well with the place. Elias continued tightening the bolt. What do you need? Warren handed him a folder. Inside was a new offer. The amount was nearly 3 times the number written on his old business card. Elias read it without expression. You said no one wanted a farm cut in half by a dead railroad. Warren glanced toward the corridor. Conditions changent. No. The railroad is still where it was. The income has changed. The access has changed. Public interest has changed. Elias closed the folder. What would you do with it now? Warren hesitated. Develop the tourism side. Expand retail. Possibly lease parts of the route. Months earlier, he had wanted to strip the stone, divide the fields, and sell the frontage. Now he wanted the system Elias had built. The difference between their 2 offers was not the land. It was proof. I am not selling, Elias said. Warren's jaw tightened. Everyone has a number. Maybe. Elias handed back the folder. But mine is not written in there. The strongest reversal came from the bank. Martin Hale visited the farm with a new appraiser. This time, they did not remain in the office or study an old map. Elias walked them along the corridor. He showed them the drainage records, the livestock gates, the water system, the service shed, the sales area, and the county agreement. The appraiser asked how much of the southern acreage had become reliably accessible. All of it, Elias said. She asked about visitor income. Elias opened his ledger. She asked about reduced operating costs. He showed her fuel, high, and feed comparisons from the previous year. The first appraisal had treated the railway as an encumbrance dividing the property. The new appraisal treated the corridor as managed infrastructure, supporting production, access, utilities, and income. A month later, Martin approved the farm's refinancing, not because Elias had removed the liability, because he had demonstrated its value. On the day the papers were signed, Martin stood outside the bank and looked at the Iron Line Farm logo on Elias's truck. You turned an abandoned railroad into real estate, he said. Elias shook his head. Real estate sits there. He looked toward the road leading home. That line works. By evening, Elias was back at the southern gate. A tractor moved slowly along the corridor carrying feed toward the far pasture. Visitors gathered near the old platform for the final tour of the season. Water ran beneath the restored culvert. Nothing about the railroad had returned to its original purpose. No locomotive would ever cross the farm again. Yet the line was carrying more kinds of value than it had when trains still ran. The people who once saw only rust now wanted access. The bank that once discounted the land now financed it, and the man who had offered to take the problem away now wanted to buy the solution. Elias watched the movement along the old grade. The railroad had not increased in value because someone important finally noticed it. Someone important noticed it because Elias had made its value impossible to ignore. Winter exposed the railroad again. The flowers disappeared. Grass flattened under frost. Leaves fell from the trees beside the embankment, revealing rusted rail, gray stone, and the long curve of the grade across Elias Mercer's farm from the barn hill. The corridor looked almost as it had when he was a boy. Almost. The difference was movement. A water line followed one edge beneath marked valve boxes. Fences guided cattle toward numbered gates. The service shed stood straight again. The drainage ditches were open, the culverts visible, and the lane firm enough to carry the tractor through frozen mornings and winter rain. Near the southern entrance, the county-funded parking area was finished but empty for the season. Beside it stood a sign explaining the history of the line. Elias had rejected the first draft. It described the railway as an abandoned industrial relic, later transformed into a tourism asset. That was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. The final version included one sentence Elias had written himself. The railroad became useful again when the farm stopped asking it to be a railroad. Calvin read the sign on the morning it was installed. That sounds like something an old man would say, he remarked. Elias looked at him. You are older than I am. That is how I recognize it. They walked north together, checking the culverts before the first hard freeze. Calvin moved more slowly now. He stopped often, pretending to inspect the ballast while catching his breath. Elias did not mention it. At the seasonal channel, water passed beneath the grade in a clear, narrow stream. No branches blocked the opening. No silt banked against the stone. The repaired slope remained stable. Calvin rested one hand on the fence. You know what happens next, he said. We clean it again in spring. That too. He looked along the corridor. People began thinking this was obvious. Elias understood. Visitors saw the finished lane, the grazing system, the flowers, and the collection shed. They saw customers arriving and county signs standing upright. They did not see the feed truck buried in mud. They did not see the calf limping beside the washout. They did not see Elias at the kitchen table with unpaid bills, or the first loan rejection lying open before him. Success made the beginning look less uncertain than it had been. It was not obvious to me, Elias said. It never is while you are inside it. At the northern boundary, they reached the section Elias had not touched. Brush still covered the rail. Rotten ties rested beneath the vines. Ownership remained unresolved, where the old railway parcel crossed neighboring land. Elias had once felt compelled to solve the entire line. Now he knew better. Some sections could remain closed until the records were clear and the work justified. The value of the corridor did not depend on using every foot of it. A system could be useful without being complete. That lesson shaped his plans for the following year. He would expand the native planting only where the slopes needed protection. He would add one more livestock gate, not 5. He would repair the loading pen roof before building anything new for visitors. The farm's income had improved, but Elias refused to borrow against imagined crowds. The railroad had become valuable because each use solved a real problem. He would not weaken it by chasing appearances. In January, Martin Hale sent the final refinancing documents. The new terms lowered Elias's monthly payments and gave him enough room to replace the oldest tractor when necessary. He signed the papers at the same kitchen table where he had once spread foreclosure notices and fuel receipts. Warren Pike did not return. His offers stopped after the county agreement became public. Elias heard that Warren had purchased land near the highway instead. The news brought Elias less satisfaction than he expected. Warren had not been defeated. He had simply moved on to another calculation. That was the difference between them. Warren searched for value he could extract. Elias had learned to recognize value that required care. By early spring, Iron Line Farm was no longer a curiosity. The restaurant in town ordered eggs and beef regularly. School groups scheduled visits around planting season. The Historical Society helped restore a small section of the service platform using donated timber. Elias kept the operation modest. Tour days remained limited. Closed gates stayed closed. No visitor entered the cattle fields without him. The farm continued to be a farm. One afternoon, Elias found a boy standing with his mother beside the viewing fence. The child stared down the rusty tracks toward the southern curve. "Do trains ever come through?" he asked. "No," Elias said. The boy appeared disappointed. "Then what are the tracks for?" Elias considered the question. Behind him, water flowed through the culvert. Beyond the fence, cattle moved toward fresh pasture. A customer carried a box from the collection shed. Bees drifted above the first spring flowers. "They remind us where to look," Elias said. The boy frowned. Uncertain, but his mother understood. After they left, Elias remained beside the rail. His father had called it the iron scar. For most of Elias's life, that description had seemed complete. The railroad had cut fields apart, diverted roads, and left behind obligations no company returned to claim. But a scar was also evidence. It showed where damage had occurred. It showed where the land had been changed. And sometimes, beneath the damage, it marked where something had been built to endure. The steel would continue to rust. The ties would eventually be removed or decay. The stories about the trains would fade as the people who remembered them grew fewer, but the grade would remain. Its stone would carry tractors. Its slope would guide water. Its height would protect pipes. Its route would connect fields that had once seemed divided. Elias looked toward the barn, where the corridor disappeared behind the hill. The railroad had come across the farm without permission and left without apology. For decades, it had seemed to own the final word. It did not. The company had abandoned steel, stone, drainage, and distance. Elias had turned them into access, water, pasture, income, and time. The old line had once carried timber, grain, machinery, and men toward places beyond the county. Now it carried the farm itself, and for Elias Mercer, that was the greatest load it had ever borne.